What happens when a good woman's compassion collides with the brutal reality of the lawless West? In a land carved by violence and grit, one lonely widow makes a choice that will seal her fate. She finds a man bleeding out in the dust, an outlaw with a price on his head. Every instinct screams for her to run to save herself, but she doesn't. Instead, she gambles her life on a stranger's soul. This isn't just a story of survival. It's the story of a love forged in gunfire and a redemption no one saw coming. The silence of the Montana Territory was a living thing. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence, a vast, unending symphony of wind whistling through the tall prairie grass, the distant cry of a hawk circling in the expansive blue sky, and the creak of old wood settling in the sun. For Serafina Hayes, this silence had become her most constant companion, a heavy blanket that had smothered the echoes of a life that was no more. Her homestead, a modest but sturdy cabin built with her late husband, stood as a solitary sentinel in the vast rolling plains. It was a testament to their shared dream, a dream that had died with Thomas 3 years ago, taken by a fever that had swept through the region with the merciless indifference of a wildfire. Now every corner of the cabin, every hand-hewn log, was imbued with his memory. The rocking chair he'd made for her still sat by the hearth, its gentle sway a ghostly imitation of his presence. The scent of pine and old leather, so uniquely him clung to the air, a constant bittersweet reminder of her loss. Serafina was a woman forged in the crucible of this harsh land. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from tilling the small vegetable garden, chopping wood and mending fences. Her face framed by waves of chestnut hair that often escaped their pins to be teased by the wind, was etched with the fine lines of worry and resilience. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a depth that spoke of a wisdom far beyond her 27 years. They had seen hope blossom and wither, love ignite and be extinguished, leaving behind an ember of strength that refused to be put out. Her days were a metronome of chores, a rhythm of survival that left little room for contemplation. She rose with the sun, its first pale fingers stretching over the distant mountains, and worked until her muscles ached and her mind was too weary for the ghosts of the past to find purchase. She tended to her chickens, their clucking a welcome disruption to the silence. She worked her garden, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. She patched the roof, mended her clothes, and hunted for small game, her skill with a rifle a necessity in this untamed world. But it was in the evenings, when the sun bled across the horizon in hues of orange and purple, that the silence grew heaviest. The world outside her small window would be painted in the soft, melancholic light of dusk, and the loneliness would creep in a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was in these moments that she felt the full weight of her solitude. She would sit in the rocking chair, her hands lying still in her lap, and let the memories wash over her. She remembered Thomas's laughter, a deep rumbling sound that had filled this small cabin with a warmth that the hearth could never replicate. She remembered the way he would hold her, his strong arms a shield against the world. They had spoken of children, of a future filled with the pitter-patter of small feet and the chaos of a growing family. Now the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the mournful sigh of the wind. The nearest town, Redemption, was a 2-day ride away, a dusty collection of buildings that offered little in the way of comfort or community for a lone widow. The occasional visit from a traveling preacher or a group of settlers passing through were the only human contact she had for months on end. The women of redemption, with their tight-lipped pity and sidelong glances, had made it clear that a woman alone was an object of suspicion and speculation. They whispered of her as the prairie witch, a woman who chose the company of wind and sky over that of her own kind. Seraphina had learned to ignore the whispers, to build a wall around her heart, as sturdy as the one she had built around her homestead. She had her pride, a fierce, unyielding thing that had been her shield since Thomas's death. She would not be an object of pity. She would not be a burden. She would survive on her own terms in the home she had built with the man she had loved. But survival was a lonely business. There were nights when she would wake from a dream of Thomas. His face so clear, his touch so real, that the emptiness of her bed was a fresh wound. There were days when the sheer, overwhelming vastness of the landscape seemed to mirror the emptiness in her soul, and she would have to fight a wave of despair that threatened to pull her under. It was on one such evening, with a storm brewing on the horizon, that the silence was broken. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper all day, began to howl, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundations of the cabin. The sky, once a placid blue, was now a canvas of bruised purples and angry greys. Seraphina secured the shutters, her movements quick and efficient, her mind focused on the familiar task of preparing for the storm. She lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. The wind shrieked a wild, untamed sound that spoke of the raw power of nature. As she stood by the window, peering out into the maelstrom, a flash of lightning illuminated the prairie, and in that brief, brilliant moment, she saw it. A shape dark and unnatural lying in the tall grass not 100 yards from her cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be anything. A fallen branch, a stray calf. But a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, and she saw it again. It was a man, and a horse standing over him, its head bowed against the wind. Her first instinct was to bolt the door, to pretend she had seen nothing. This was a land where trouble found you, where strangers were rarely a source of comfort. A man out in a storm like this was a man in trouble, and trouble was a contagion she could not afford to catch. She had built her life on a foundation of caution, of avoiding the very kind of danger that now lay at her doorstep. But then another image flashed in her mind. Thomas, his face pale with fever, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She remembered her own helplessness, her desperate prayers to a silent God. She had been alone then, and she had lost him. The thought of another human being suffering and alone while she was safe and warm inside her cabin was a weight she could not bear. The wind howled a chorus of voices urging her to stay inside to protect herself. But a stronger voice, the voice of her own conscience, urged her to act. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she unbolted the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at her dress, whipping her hair across her face. Rain cold and sharp as needles began to fall. But she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the lantern and, shielding its flame with her hand, began to walk towards the fallen man, towards the unknown, towards the moment that would change her life forever. The walk to the fallen man was a battle against the elements. The wind, a physical force, pushed against her, trying to drive her back to the safety of her cabin. The rain now, a torrential downpour, soaked her to the bone, the cold seeping into her skin. The lantern cast a small, flickering circle of light, a fragile shield against the overwhelming darkness. As she drew closer, the scene came into sharper focus. The man was lying face down in the mud, one arm flung out, as if reaching for something. His clothes, dark and heavy with rain, were torn and mud-splattered. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, stood guard over him, its eyes wide with fear and loyalty. It whinnied nervously as she approached, its breath coming in white plumes in the cold air. "Easy, boy," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the storm. "Easy now." She reached the man and knelt beside him, the lantern casting a ghoulish glow on his still form. With a deep breath, she gently rolled him over. Her breath caught in her throat. His face, though pale and streaked with mud, was handsome in a rugged, dangerous way. A dark stubble covered his jaw, and a lock of black hair fell across his forehead. But it was the blood that held her attention. A dark, spreading stain on his shirt, just below his ribs. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, his lips tinged with blue. For a moment, she was frozen, the full weight of her decision crashing down on her. This was no ordinary traveler caught in a storm. This was a man who had been shot. An outlaw, most likely. The kind of man Thomas had always warned her about. The kind of man who brought nothing but trouble and death in his wake. The wind howled a devil's whisper in her ear. "Leave him. Go back to your cabin. Lock the door. Forget what you saw." It was the voice of self-preservation, the voice of fear. But then she looked at his face again, at the vulnerability in his unconscious features, and she saw not an outlaw, but a human being on the brink of death. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't leave him. To do so would be to betray the very core of her own humanity. With a grunt of effort, she tried to lift him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She was strong, but not strong enough to carry him. She looked at the horse, a glimmer of an idea forming in her mind. She approached the stallion cautiously, her hand outstretched. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Help me." The horse, as if understanding her intent, lowered its head and allowed her to take the reins. With a great deal of effort, and with the horse's unwitting assistance, she managed to get the man draped over the saddle. The journey back to the cabin was even more arduous than the journey out. The wind and rain were relentless, and the man's weight made the horse stumble and slide in the mud. Finally they reached the cabin. She half dragged, half carried the man inside her muscles, screaming in protest. She laid him on the braided rug in front of the hearth, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the cold that clung to him. She quickly stripped off his wet clothes, her movements clinical and detached, trying not to think about the intimacy of the act. His body was a tapestry of old scars, a testament to a life lived on the edge. But it was the new wound that demanded her attention. It was a clean shot, but it was deep, and it was still bleeding sluggishly. She knew she had to get the bullet out. She had helped her father, a doctor in a small town back east, with similar wounds when she was a girl. She had a steady hand and a strong stomach. She sterilized a knife in the fire, her face grim. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and began to work. The man groaned, his body tensing, but he didn't wake. She worked quickly, her focus absolute. Finally, she found it a small, misshapen piece of lead lodged against a rib. She carefully extracted it, a wave of relief washing over her. She cleaned the wound as best she could with whiskey and hot water, then packed it with a poultice of herbs she had learned to use from a traveling Indian woman. She bandaged it tightly with strips of clean linen, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency. She spent the rest of the night by his side, bathing his fevered brow, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. The storm raged outside, a reflection of the turmoil in her own heart. She had brought a devil into her home, a man with a past that was undoubtedly as dark as the storm that had brought him to her. But as she watched him as she fought to keep the flickering flame of his life from being extinguished, she felt something else as well. A sense of purpose, a connection to another human being that she hadn't felt since Thomas had died. As dawn broke, the storm finally subsided, leaving a world washed clean and new. The sun rose, casting a golden light over the prairie. The man was still unconscious, but his breathing was deeper, his color a little better. She had done all she could. Now it was up to him. She went outside to tend to the horse, a magnificent creature that was as much a victim of circumstance as its master. She gave it water and a handful of oats, her movements gentle. The horse nuzzled her hand, a silent thank you. She spent the day in a state of nervous tension, her ears attuned to any sound from the cabin. She went about her chores, but her mind was elsewhere. She was constantly aware of the man lying in her home, a dangerous, unpredictable element that had shattered the fragile peace of her existence. That evening, as she sat by the fire, mending a tear in her dress, he stirred. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, flickered open. They were dazed and confused at first. Then they focused on her, and a flicker of something else, fear perhaps, or suspicion, crossed his face. Where am I?" he rasped, his voice rough and unused. "You're safe," she said, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the turmoil she was feeling. "You were shot. I found you in the storm." He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and a grimace of pain told him it was a mistake. He fell back against the pillows she had placed under his head. "Who are you?" he asked, his eyes never leaving her face. "My name is Serafina Hayes," she replied. "And you are—" He hesitated, his eyes guarded. "Silas," he said finally. "My name is Silas." He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't ask for one. It was better that way. The less she knew, the safer she would be. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a little stronger now. "I did what anyone would have done," she said, though she knew it wasn't true. "No," he said, his gaze intense. "Not just anyone." He drifted off to sleep again after that, but the look in his eyes lingered with her. It was a look of gratitude, yes, but also of something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Something that both frightened and intrigued her. She had brought a stranger into her home, a man with a past that was a blank page she was afraid to read. She had saved his life, but in doing so she had put her own in jeopardy. The devil was at her doorstep, and she had let him in. And now she had to live with the consequences. The silence of her life had been broken, and she had a feeling it would never be the same again. The days that followed settled into a strange and quiet rhythm, a delicate dance of care and caution. Silas's recovery was slow, a testament to the severity of his wound. He spent most of his time in a fever-induced haze, his body fighting the infection that threatened to claim him. Serafina was a constant presence by his side, her life now revolving around the needs of the stranger in her home. She changed his bandages, the sight of the angry red wound, a constant reminder of the violence that had brought him to her. She brewed herbal remedies, their earthy scents filling the small cabin. She spoon-fed him broth, her hand steady as she held the spoon to his lips. In his moments of lucidity, he would watch her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and a deep, unsettling curiosity. They spoke little, their conversations clipped and cautious. They were two strangers bound together by circumstance, each wary of revealing too much of themselves. She learned that he was from Texas, that he had been on his way to California when he had been ambushed. He spoke of the men who had shot him as business associates, a euphemism that sent a chill down her spine. He in turn learned about her life in a series of small, unspoken observations. He saw the sadness in her eyes when she looked at the rocking chair by the fire. He noticed the way her hands, though calloused, were gentle as they tended to his wound. He heard the loneliness in her voice when she thought he was asleep and would hum a sad, forgotten tune. The cabin, which had once been a sanctuary of solitude, now felt small and crowded. The presence of another person, another life, filled the space in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was a constant source of tension, a low hum of awareness that kept her on edge. She would wake in the night, her heart pounding, and listen to the sound of his breathing, a reminder that she was not alone. But the reminder brought not comfort, but a fresh wave of fear. Who was this man she was harboring? What kind of trouble would he bring to her door? One afternoon, as she was changing his bandages, he spoke, his voice clear and steady. "You have a gentle touch," he said, his eyes fixed on her face. She paused, her fingers hovering over the wound. "I learned from my father," she said, her voice a little breathless. "He was a doctor." "A doctor's daughter hiding out in the middle of nowhere," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "There's a story there." "We all have a story, Silas," she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. She finished tying the bandage and stood up, putting a safe distance between them. "You're right about that," he said, his smile fading. "And most stories are best left untold." The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of the pasts they were both so careful to keep hidden. She knew he was a dangerous man, a man who lived by a code she couldn't possibly understand. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, she began to see another side of him. She saw the way he would watch a spider spin its web in the corner of the ceiling, his expression one of quiet contemplation. She saw the flicker of amusement in his eyes when her cat, a ginger tom named Marmalade, would curl up on his chest, purring contentedly. She saw the gratitude in his eyes every time she brought him a meal, a gratitude that seemed to go beyond the simple act of being fed. He was a man of contradictions, a puzzle she couldn't help but try to solve. He was a man who had known violence, yet he had a surprising gentleness about him. He was a man who had lived a life of danger, yet he seemed to appreciate the simple peace of her home. One evening, as she was reading by the fire, he asked her to read aloud. She hesitated at first, but then she began to read from a book of poems by a woman named Emily Dickinson, a book that had been a gift from Thomas. The words, filled with a quiet beauty and a profound understanding of the human heart, filled the small cabin. She read for an hour, her voice soft and melodic. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a long time since I heard something so beautiful." In that moment, the wall she had built around her heart cracked a little. She saw not an outlaw, but a man with a soul, a man who had been starved of beauty and gentleness. But the world outside her cabin was not a poem. It was a harsh, unforgiving place, and the past had a way of catching up with you no matter how far you ran. A few days later, a rider approached the cabin. Seraphina's heart leaped into her throat. She quickly hid Silas's gun and holster, then went to the door, her face a mask of calm. It was the sheriff from Redemption, a man named Wallace, his face a road map of sun and wind and too much whiskey. He was a man who prided himself on knowing everything that happened in his territory. "Afternoon, missus," "Hayes," he said, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Just making my rounds. Heard there was some trouble out this way a few weeks back. A stagecoach robbery." "I haven't heard anything about it." "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Funny," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We tracked the robbers this far. Then the trail went cold, like they just vanished into thin air." He dismounted and walked towards Hoard. Towards the cabin, his spurs jingling with each step. "You seen anyone suspicious around here lately?" "Mrs. Hayes, a man on a black stallion, maybe." "No one," she said, her voice firm. "Just me and the wind." He peered past her into the cabin, his gaze lingering on the rug where Silas had lain, now clean and empty. "You sure about that, a woman alone out here? It's not safe." "I can take care of myself, Sheriff," she said, her hand unconsciously straying to the rifle that was always propped by the door. He chuckled a dry, humorless sound. "I'm sure you can, Mrs. Hayes. I'm sure you can." He tipped his hat and rode away, but Serafina knew he wasn't convinced. He would be back. She went back inside her hands, trembling. Silas was awake, his face pale, but his eyes clear. "He's looking for me," he said, his voice flat. "He won't find you," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. "He will," he said. "Men like him always do." The sheriff's visit was a stark reminder of the danger she was in. She was harboring a fugitive, a man with a price on his head. If she were caught, she would be branded an accomplice, an outlaw herself. She could lose everything: her home, her freedom, her life. And yet the thought of turning him in, of sending him to the gallows, was something she couldn't stomach. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had become responsible for it. She was trapped, caught between the law and her own conscience. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She looked over at Silas, who was sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed and unguarded. In the soft glow of the firelight, he looked almost boyish, a far cry from the dangerous outlaw she knew him to be. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. All she knew was that she was in too deep to turn back now. The unspoken words and the unseen dangers that filled her small cabin were now a part of her life, a part of her story. And she had a feeling that the most dangerous chapter was yet to come. The fragile peace that had settled over the cabin was shattered a week later. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day that lulls you into a false sense of security. Serafina was in the garden, her hands in the soil, the sun warm on her back. Silas, now strong enough to walk, was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of wood with a knife she had given him. He was still weak, but his recovery was progressing a small victory in a world that seemed determined to defeat them. Then she saw them. 3 riders on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the bright blue sky. They were riding hard, kicking up a cloud of dust that marked their approach. A cold dread washed over her. This was not the sheriff. This was something else, something far more dangerous. "Silas!" she called out, her voice tight with fear. "Inside! Now!" He looked up, his eyes following her gaze. He saw the riders and his face hardened, the gentle lines of contemplation replaced by the sharp angles of a man who knew violence was coming. He stood up, his movements still a little stiff, and went inside, grabbing his gun from its hiding place. "Stay down," he said, his voice a low growl. "And whatever you do, don't open the door." She crouched behind the window, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. The riders were closer now, and she could see their faces. They were hard, cruel men, their eyes cold and empty. The man in the lead was a mountain of a man with a thick black beard and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He was the kind of man who inspired fear just by his presence. They reined in their horses in front of the cabin, the sound of their hooves a thunderous intrusion on the quiet afternoon. "Silas!" The big man bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar. "We know you're in there. Come on out and face us like a man." There was no answer from inside the cabin. "Don't make us come in and get you, Silas," the man shouted. "You know we will, and we'll be a lot less gentle than the last time." He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He walked to the door and kicked it, the wood groaning in protest. "I'm not asking again, Silas. Go away, Rufus." Silas called out, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the tension that filled the small cabin. "This has nothing to do with the woman." "The woman?" Rufus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "So that's what this is about. You found yourself a little prairie flower to hide behind. I always knew you were yellow, Silas." He kicked the door again, harder this time. The wood splintered. "Leave her out of this, Rufus," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "It's a little late for that," Rufus said. "She's already involved. Now are you coming out, or do we have to burn you out?" Seraphina's blood ran cold. She looked at Silas, his face a mask of grim determination. She knew he was trapped. If he went out, they would kill him. If he stayed in, they would kill them both. "There's a back window," he said, his voice a whisper. "When I give the signal, you run. Don't look back. Just run." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. "You have to," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I won't let them hurt you." He moved to the front window, his gun held steady in his hand. "All right, Rufus," he called out. "You win. I'm coming out." "That's more like it," Rufus said, a triumphant sneer on his face. "But first," Silas said, "I want your word that you won't harm the woman." Rufus laughed again. "My word? What makes you think my word is worth anything?" "Because if you touch her," Silas said, his voice as cold as ice, "I'll make sure you die screaming." There was a moment of silence, then Rufus said, "All right, Silas, you have my word. The woman is safe. Now come on out." Silas looked at Seraphina, his eyes filled with a regret that tore at her heart. "Go," he mouthed. He took a deep breath and threw open the door, his gun blazing. The roar of the gunshot was deafening in the small cabin. Seraphina didn't hesitate. She ran to the back window, climbed out, and ran. She didn't look back. She just ran, the sound of gunshots echoing behind her. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they were on fire. She didn't stop until she reached a small copse of trees where she collapsed, gasping for breath. She crouched behind a tree, her body trembling, and listened. The gunshots had stopped. A terrible silence had fallen over the prairie. She didn't know how long she waited, her mind a numb haze of fear and despair. Had he survived? Had he killed them? Or had they killed him? The uncertainty was a torture worse than any physical pain. Finally, as the sun began to set, she heard a horse approaching. She peeked out from behind the tree, her heart in her throat. It was Silas's black stallion, and Silas was in the saddle, slumped over his face, pale, his shirt stained with fresh blood. She ran to him, her feet flying over the ground. "Silas!" she cried out. He looked up. his eyes glazed with pain. "Seraphina," he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "I knew you'd wait." He swayed in the saddle, and she reached up to steady him. He had another wound, this one high on his shoulder. It was bleeding freely. "We have to get you back to the cabin," she said, her voice urgent. "No," he said. "It's not safe there. They'll be back." "Where can we go?" she asked, her voice filled with desperation. "There's a place," he said, his voice growing weaker. "An old line shack, in the hills, not far from here." She helped him dismount, his weight heavy against her. She knew she couldn't get him back on the horse by herself. She would have to lead the horse and help him walk. It would be a slow, arduous journey, but they had no other choice. They set off into the fading light, a desperate pair of fugitives fleeing from the shadows of the past. The journey was a nightmare of pain and exhaustion. Silas was weak from blood loss, and he leaned heavily on her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step was an agony for him, but he never complained. He just gritted his teeth and kept going, his determination a testament to his will to survive. They finally reached the line shack just after midnight, a dilapidated structure that offered little in the way of comfort, but was a welcome sight nonetheless. She helped him inside and laid him on a dusty bunk. She lit a fire in the small stove, the warmth a welcome relief from the chill of the night. She tended to his new wound, her hands moving with a now practiced efficiency. The bullet had gone clean through a small miracle in a day of disasters. She cleaned the wound and bandaged it as best she could with the limited supplies she had. She sat by his side all night, watching him sleep, his face a mask of pain, even in his unconsciousness. She thought about the events of the day, about the violence that had erupted in her quiet life. She had been a spectator in her own life for so long, a passive observer of the world around her. But today, she had been a participant. She had made a choice, and that choice had led her here to this derelict shack in the middle of nowhere, with a wounded outlaw by her side. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if they would ever be safe. But as she looked at Silas, at the man who had risked his life to save hers, she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer just a spectator. She was a part of his story now, and he was a part of hers, and they would face whatever came next together. The shadow of the past was long and dark, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. The line shack became their world, a small, self-contained universe of survival and unspoken emotions. The days were a blur of tending to Silas's wounds, foraging for food, and keeping a constant nervous watch on the surrounding hills. The shadow of Rufus and his men loomed large, a constant unseen threat that kept them on edge. Silas's recovery was a slow, arduous process. The new wound, though not as severe as the first, had taken its toll on his already weakened body. He was often in pain, his face pale and drawn, but he never complained. He would sit for hours, his back against the rough-hewn wall of the shack, his eyes scanning the horizon, a silent sentinel guarding their fragile sanctuary. In the forced intimacy of their confinement, the walls between them began to crumble. The cautious dance of strangers was replaced by the easy familiarity of two people who had faced death together. They talked more, their conversations no longer clipped and guarded, but filled with the stories of their pasts, the dreams of their futures. She told him about Thomas, about the life they had planned to build together, about the crushing weight of her grief. He listened, his eyes filled with a deep, compassionate understanding. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy comfort. He just listened, and in his listening she found a solace she hadn't known she was missing. He in turn told her about his life, a story of poverty and desperation that had led him to a life of crime. He spoke of a younger brother he had been trying to protect, of a debt he had been forced to pay. He didn't make excuses for his past, but he painted a picture of a man who had been trapped by circumstance, a man who had made bad choices for what he thought were the right reasons. One evening as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of the shack, he reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "Serafina," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I never asked for your help. I never deserved it. But you gave it to me anyway. You saved my life not once but twice. And you've shown me a kindness I didn't think existed in this world." She looked at him, her heart filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "You would have done the same for me, Silas?" she said, her voice a whisper. "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I wouldn't have. Not before I met you. You've changed me, Serafina. You've made me want to be a better man." He leaned in and kissed her a gentle, tentative kiss that was filled with all the unspoken words that had passed between them. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of danger and desperation. In that moment, she knew she was lost. She had fallen in love with a man with a past, a man with a price on his head, a man who represented everything she had been taught to fear. But in his arms, she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of rightness that she hadn't felt since Thomas had died. Their days took on a new rhythm, a rhythm of shared hopes and dreams. They talked of a future together, a future far away from the violence and danger of their pasts. They talked of California, of a small ranch by the sea, of a life of peace and quiet. It was a fragile dream, a wisp of smoke in the wind, but it was a dream that sustained them, that gave them the strength to face each new day. But the past was not so easily escaped. One morning, Silas returned from a scouting trip, his face grim. "They're close," he said, his voice flat. "I saw their tracks, they're circling, closing in." The fragile bubble of their dream burst, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. They couldn't stay in the shack any longer. It was a trap, a dead end. "We have to leave," he said. "Tonight." That night, under the cover of darkness, they slipped away from the shack, two shadows in the moonlight. They traveled light, taking only what they could carry. They walked for hours, their path illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Just before dawn, they reached a crossroads. One path led west towards California, towards their dream. The other path led east towards redemption, towards the law. Silas stopped, his face a mask of conflict. "This is where we part ways, Serafina," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her heart sinking. "I can't take you with me," he said. "As long as I'm with you, you'll never be safe. Rufus will never stop hunting me, and I can't live with the thought of you constantly looking over your shoulder, of you living in fear because of me." "I'm not afraid, Silas," she said, her voice fierce. "I'm with you. That's all that matters." "It matters to me," he said, his voice breaking. "I love you too much to condemn you to a life on the run." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He emptied its contents into her hand. It was a handful of gold coins, more money than she had ever seen in her life. "This is my share from the stagecoach robbery," he said. "It's not much, but it's enough to get you to California, to buy that ranch by the sea." "I don't want your money, Silas," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I want you. And I want you to be safe," he said. "I want you to have a life, a real life, not this." He gestured to the dark, empty prairie around them. He pulled her to him and kissed her a desperate, passionate kiss that was both a hello and a goodbye. "I have to go back," he said. "I have to face them. It's the only way to end this." "They'll kill you," she sobbed. "Maybe," he said, "but it's a chance I have to take. For you." He turned and walked away, his figure a lonely silhouette against the rising sun. She watched him go, her heart breaking with every step he took. She wanted to call out to him, to beg him to come back, but she knew it was useless. He had made his choice. She stood at the crossroads for a long time, the gold coins heavy in her hand, the weight of his sacrifice heavy on her heart. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The path to California seemed empty and meaningless without him. Finally, with a heavy heart, she turned and began to walk not towards California, but back towards her homestead. It was a foolish, reckless thing to do. But she couldn't just leave. She had to know. She had to know if the man she loved had survived. She had to know if their dream had a chance to become a reality, or if it had died with him on a dusty road at dawn. The crossroads had presented her with a choice, and she had chosen the path of hope, a path that was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but a path that was the only one her heart would allow her to take. The weeks that followed Silas's departure were the longest of Serafina's life. The silence that had once been her companion now felt like a crushing weight each day, an eternity of waiting and wondering. She returned to her homestead, a place that was now filled with the ghosts of both Thomas and Silas. The cabin felt empty, the prairie vast and lonely. She tried to resume her old life, to find solace in the familiar rhythm of her chores. But the spectre of Silas's fate hung over her, a dark cloud that blocked out the sun. Every rider she saw on the horizon sent a jolt of fear through her. Every knock on the door made her heart leap into her throat. She heard whispers in redemption tales of a shootout in the hills of Rufus, and his men found dead of an unknown gunman who had disappeared without a trace. The sheriff had come by again, his questions more pointed this time, his eyes more suspicious, but he could prove nothing, and eventually he left her in peace. She clung to a fragile sliver of hope, a hope that was as resilient as the prairie grass that bent in the wind, but never broke. She told herself that Silas was alive, that he had somehow survived, that he would come back for her. It was a fool's hope, perhaps, but it was the only thing that kept her going. Then one evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, she saw him, a lone rider on the horizon, his silhouette familiar against the dying light. Her heart stopped, then started again, a wild, frantic beat. Could it be? Was it really him? She stood up, her hand shielding her eyes, and watched as the rider drew closer. It was him. It was Silas. But it was a different Silas. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed. He was wearing a new suit of clothes, the kind a respectable man would wear. He looked older, wiser. The harsh lines of his face softened by a new sense of peace. He reined in his horse in front of the cabin and dismounted. He walked towards her, his eyes never leaving her face. He stopped a few feet away, a hesitant smile on his lips. "Serafina," he said, his voice soft. "Silas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I told you I'd come back," he said, I never doubted you." She lied, the tears she had held back for so long finally streaming down her face. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as if he would never let her go. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, a scent that was now mixed with the clean smell of soap and a new beginning. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's all over." He told her what had happened. He had gone back to redemption and turned himself in. He had confessed to the stagecoach robbery, but he had also provided evidence of Rufus's other crimes that were far worse than his own. He had made a deal. He had served a short sentence, and then he had been released a free man with a clean slate. "I used the rest of the money to buy a small ranch," he said, his eyes shining with a new light. "In California, by the sea. It's waiting for us, Serafina. If you'll have me." He got down on one knee, his eyes never leaving hers. "Serafina Hayes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, but you did more than that. You saved my soul. You taught me how to love, how to hope, how to be a man worthy of your love. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She looked at him, at the man who had ridden into her life on a storm, and had brought with him a whirlwind of danger and passion. He was a man who had been redeemed, a man who had fought for his future, for their future. "Yes," she said, her voice a whisper. "Yes, Silas. 1,000 times, yes." He stood up and kissed her a kiss that was a promise of a new life, a new beginning. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a fate that had been written in the stars on a stormy night on the Montana prairie. They left the next day, turning their backs on the past and riding towards the future. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They had found their home in each other, their sanctuary, in a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, more beautiful, more resilient than they could have ever imagined. The silence of the prairie was replaced by the sound of their laughter, the rhythm of their hearts beating as one. A symphony of hope and love that would echo through the years, a testament to the enduring power of redemption and the extraordinary courage of a woman who had dared to love an outlaw. In a world that demanded toughness, Serafina Hayes showed a different kind of strength, the strength to see the man behind the outlaw, the soul behind the sin. Theirs is a timeless story of how a single act of compassion can rewrite a destiny, proving that even in the harshest of lands, love and redemption can bloom. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest gambles we take are on each other. If this story of love, danger, and second chances moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a powerful tale from the Old West. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of history's most unforgettable characters. Click that notification bell so you never miss an adventure.